The Last Library, a novella, written by Hubert L. Mullins, narrated by Darla Middlebrook. Part 1. Without libraries, what have we? We have no past and no future. Ray Bradbury. He wasn't sure if the smell of blood had finally gone away, baked off the hot asphalt like red mud, or if he'd just grown accustomed to the stench. It couldn't be helped these days. Blood was everywhere, or at least it had been 2 years ago when everybody died. When people started bleeding out of their ears and nose and mouth, and when all the holes that the good Lord gave them poured blood, the body found new holes. People died in the most undignified ways there at the end of the Harvard flu. That bug took all the people, all the creatures of the air, the land, and although he'd never checked, probably the sea. He'd only been near the ocean once since it all happened, but that was from a distance, and he was sure those large masses along the beach were whales. But then again, large piles of stuff weren't exactly rare after the flu. People often piled their own dead onto similar heaps. They knew one day they'd be lying upon that same pile. Ryan Stewart sat there on the stone bench, drinking a can of warm ginger ale, hoping it would settle his stomach. All food was a gamble these days, whether it be canned peaches, canned ham, canned beans, or canned fruit cocktail. Nothing had an infinite shelf life. True, some things lasted longer than others, but now, 2 years since the last can rolled off an assembly line, food was starting to contaminate. "I think it was the peas, Mutt," said Ryan, looking over to his companion, who just stared blankly down the street toward the heaping mounds of bodies. National Geographic showed elephants all the time, back when there were still people watching, back when television still existed. But that channel never prepared him for what dead elephants, long simmering in the hot sun, would eventually look like. It was a bloated mess, dried up in some places and showing bones in others. There had been no other animals to prey on it. This place was a monument to that. Dead animals everywhere. Ryan sat with his companion just outside the reptile house in Knoxville Zoo, some 170 miles from home. It was so quiet here, much different than the last time when he and Tabitha and Gabe came through. But then again, it was quiet everywhere. Even the bugs had died. In the beginning, the stillness was unnerving. No birds chirping, no crickets or frogs at night, no traffic, no trains, no sirens. But now he hardly noticed. The only sounds he ever heard were his boots crushing the old world wherever he walked. "Remember when we first brought you home?" Ryan asked Mutt. Silence. "Gabe was so happy to have you. Finally started sleeping in his own bed because of you, bud. Me and his mommy could never make him do that." Silence. "I'll leave you here if you want. This was your home before we took you. And let's face it, my home, our home, isn't really a home anymore." Mutt's ear had a tiny bit of Gabe's blood on it, which was amazing because Mutt had been all the way across the room when the boy took his last breath. That was an awful day. A day Ryan had thought about for close to 700 days since. He couldn't shake it, but he wouldn't be thinking of it much longer. His farewell tour was almost over. He couldn't let Mutt stay here, not with all the dead. Ryan was going to keep him to the end, and that was that. The little stuffed animal, the red panda who was now dangling one plastic eye, had been bought just right down the street from where they were sitting. This was near Big Cat Country, and it was both mesmerizing and heartbreaking to see so many large tufts of fur just blowing in the wind, as if the tigers and lions were sleeping in the hot sun and not dead from the virus. This was still worthy of awe, thought Ryan. Just like in life, people were common and animals were rare and something to behold. That hadn't changed. Dead people were common. Dead exotic animals were not. There was a morbidity to it that he recognized, but he still couldn't shake the fact that he was standing just outside of so many natural wonders that time would one day erase completely. We've been here 2 days. Think we should head on back? This place is depressing me. He picked up Mutt without even waiting, and feeling silly for assuming it wouldn't be depressing. Everything was depressing these days. There was no one left. Everyone had been taken by the Harvard flu. Everyone but Ryan. He didn't know why, but on most days he felt that was a greater curse than what had happened to his family. At least they got sick, and shortly after, it was over. His suffering was allowed to go on for years. Even the most reclusive introverts would have trouble in this kind of solitude. Before they left, and just as Ryan had done at every major location he'd visited, he took out his can of black spray paint, got his ladder from the RV, and painted his same message for a world that no longer read. I was alive. After everything, I was alive. Find me at the Greenbrier. The end of the world wasn't how everyone thought it would be. In books and television, the future was always heralded by nuclear fallout, and while most of the reactors around the globe had probably already gone critical, that's not how the world ended. There were no roving gangs of bandits. There were no mutant cannibals. There wasn't even large-scale destruction other than 2 years' worth of neglect. Most notable of all, there were no riots or mass hysteria. The Harvard flu was tricky, cunning, and it swept in and took everyone like some horrible, painful rapture. The news called it the Harvard flu because the first case was studied at Mass General, and many of those early infections were of what the medium called the healthy affluent. Ryan remembered the only hysteria that came was when the coughing and watery eyes symptoms first appeared. That was the first stage. Eyes watering so bad you thought someone was crying. After that, the CDC gave it a technical name, but no one ever called it that. It was always the Harvard flu or the Ivy flu. At the end, a few people even called it the boss killer, because even if you were rich and healthy, it still sought you out and made your brain hemorrhage. But the deadliest aspect of the Harvard flu was it mutated in a way that kept researchers one step behind. It was as though it knew it were being watched, studied, selected for extinction. Every inch gained, and the virus replicated into something completely unknown. Ryan remembered hearing a researcher on live television, with tears streaming down his face and his chest rattling with each breath, that the good news is that viruses weaken each time they change. Our universe goes from high power to low power. A cup of coffee on a table cools down rather than heats up. While this is scary right now, the virus will eventually replicate itself out of existence. And for 2 weeks, that's what appeared to have happened. If the virologists had decided to start testing animals, they would have seen that traces of the virus were present. This epidemic did not discriminate. Everything that had blood could catch the virus. In hindsight, Ryan wondered if the ability to cross species helped make it stronger. It certainly helped to make it more global. The Harvard flu wasn't so easily subdued. It went away, or at least the symptoms did. The virus all but disappeared from blood cells. People started getting better. The coughs and runny eyes vanished. Local news channels started talking about sports, the weather, the president. All the while, the Harvard flu was buried there, strengthening, gathering troops, ready to assault the humankind and the animal kingdom in one last daring battle. 2 days before Halloween, the first cases of the virus's final mutation began filling the airwaves. At first, people assumed it was unrelated. After all, every symptom of it had gone away, and blood work across the planet was confirming it was no longer there. Also, this wasn't symptomatic of any virus. People were bleeding from every hole in their body so intensely that sometimes the blood loss was what killed them. Early autopsies showed the blood full of the virus, now so mutated and twisted that it was a work of art more than a pathogen. Virologists had never seen such a thing. Ryan remembered the CDC spokesperson on the news the third night of the hemorrhaging. She had a stack of papers, tears in her eyes, and she was smoking a cigarette. How often these days did you see someone on the news with a lit cigarette? She was about to launch into her appointed "Don't Panic" speech, but before she began, she simply looked at her stack of papers and shook her head. She slid them off the podium with shaky fingers where they cascaded down around her feet. Then, looking at the camera, she said, "We aren't going to beat this. Hug your family. They'll be gone in a week." Tabitha had been trying to reach her mom on the phone, but of course by then cellular services were starting to go offline. Gabe was on the floor, playing with his trucks. It was the first day since his runny eyes had gone away, and he was finally feeling better. Optimistically, the human race made it about 3 weeks if the local humans and fauna, to Ryan, were any indication of the global pandemic. 3 weeks from that news broadcast, everyone across the planet was dead. Everyone he saw on television, dead. All of his loved ones, dead. All dogs and cats and fish and birds, dead. The world was quiet. A long, utterly maddening hush had fallen. Everyone was gone. Everyone except Ryan. As long as the bridges held, getting around the country wasn't much of a problem. The virus took everyone swiftly. There wasn't any time to panic, so there weren't many traffic jams. There were no roadblocks, no military, no SWAT. Every now and then, there would be parked cars choking the highway, but Ryan could deal with that. He was driving a wrecker truck, something he'd borrowed from a mall parking lot. Whenever something was in the road, he'd drop his RV, move the obstruction with the wrecker, then pick up the RV and be on his way. The spacious RV was permanently lifted by the wrecker. Whenever he and Mutt, who always rode shotgun with his seatbelt on because safety first, would drive anywhere, and it would be in the wrecker. Now that he thought about it, the RV might not even be able to start on its own anyway. By now it was a camper that held all his food, books, and memories. He belonged nowhere and everywhere at the same time. It would only be a matter of time before all the food went bad. Only a small, relatively small, portion of it remained. Perishables had long since turned. He had no worries about food, mainly because he wouldn't be here much longer, but also because it was now his to own. Here at the end of the world, he only had to fight time and decay. No more were there predators or scavengers. Ryan had the whole world's food supply, for whatever it was worth, at his fingertips. He was tired, but that was nothing new. They'd often drive through the day, then stop for the night and sleep. Ryan didn't even have to pull over anymore. He could just drop the RV in the road, because there'd never be another car coming. Every now and then, he'd see a glint of the moon off the rain-slicked road or off a lake and think it was headlights. Even 2 years after the last person spoke to him, he could still trick himself into believing there were still others.